She sat, unable to lift her head, in the deep shadows of the chambers, where the curtains were tightly drawn and the air was thick, stifling, saturated with the smell of wet fabric, stale sweat, and something sweet and rotten. Her hands trembled as the maid held a copper bowl and wiped the remains of cloudy saliva mixed with blood from her lips. The skin on her face was stretched tight, her temples were sunken, and dark, almost blue shadows lay under her eyes. Rumors that the Queen could not stand up were already spreading throughout London, although the reports of the Privy Council said the opposite. But in reality, Elizabeth's last weeks were not only a time of physical decline, but also a slow breakdown of all the ties of power she had built up over many decades. According to her physician's personal journal, the first alarming signs appeared at the beginning of the cold season: constant weakness, loss of appetite, and swelling in her legs. The court physician, trained in the old ways, with descriptions of bloodletting and poultices, initially prescribed laxatives and ointments made from crushed herbs mixed with animal fat. However, by the middle of winter, the skin on her hands and face became rough, her lips cracked, and purple spots began to appear on her body. She began to refuse food, preferring only warm wine mixed with opium, which, according to her servants, made her eyes cloudy and slowed her speech. The weaker the Queen's body became, the less trust there was in her decisions. Her advisers, who had recently been willing to wait for hours for an audience, now gathered in separate rooms, whispering and discussing possible successors. At night, there was an unusual noise in the palace corridors: footsteps, voices, quiet knocks on closed doors. Guards increasingly restricted access to the Queen's chambers, citing the danger of infection. It was said that the disease could be transmitted by touching the bed or clothing of the sick. Elizabeth's condition worsened. The swelling turned into ulcers on her legs, from which a cloudy liquid oozed and soaked into the fabric of her stockings. When the bandages were changed, the smell became so strong that the maids, unable to bear it, covered their noses and turned away. According to later records, one of them lost consciousness and fell directly onto the stone floor, after which she was taken away and no longer allowed to approach the patient. The doctors tried applying warming compresses and rubbing the skin with oil mixed with beeswax, but this only caused the tissue to swell and the pain to intensify. The Queen screamed more and more often at night, demanding relief, but refused strong doses of opium, fearing that it would hasten her death and send her soul to God's judgment without the opportunity to confess. The clergy, summoned to the palace, insisted on confession and communion, but she delayed this moment, citing weakness. According to one of the chaplains, who secretly kept records, the Queen said in moments of lucidity that she was afraid of dying unclean before the Lord, meaning that her enemies were waiting for just that. At times, in her delirium, she called out to her deceased relatives and advisers, as if they could enter and calm her. Servants passing by the doors heard fragments of phrases spoken in a sing-song voice, as if she were talking not to the living, but to shadows. Meanwhile, the political situation around her bed became increasingly tense. The old nobility sought to maintain control over the inheritance, while young favorites and advisers tried to seize power for themselves. Ambassadors of foreign powers reported that the English crown hangs by a thread, and the fate of the throne is being decided in corridors that reek of death. The guards were changed every few hours, and the men were selected from among those who had no close ties to any of the parties. According to one report, in the last days of winter, the queen was no longer lifted from her bed. Her face had become gaunt, her skin almost transparent, with dark veins showing through. Her breathing was wheezy, with long pauses, and at times it seemed that she was no longer breathing at all. The doctors gathered at the door and argued about whether to continue the bloodletting, which, according to their calculations, was supposed to remove the bad blood, but in fact only weakened the body even more. In the end, it was decided to limit treatment to decoctions of dried roots, but Elizabeth took them reluctantly. During this time, letters began to be brought to her chambers, which, under the guise of concern, contained hints about the need to transfer power. She tore them up, threw the scraps on the floor, and then ordered them to be burned in the fireplace. Servants reported that after each such visit, her pain intensified, and she would sit motionless for long periods, staring at a single point, as if weighing something. One of her physicians later wrote that the disease of her body was nourished by the poisoned air of intrigue, no less than her blood was nourished by the rot of her own wounds. This was only the first phase of her decline, and even then it became clear in the palace that no ointments, no poultices, and no prayers could restore the queen to her former strength. But what began in those weeks was only a harbinger of even more terrible days, when not only her body but also her power would begin to crumble before the eyes of the entire country. In early spring, when a damp, cold fog still hung over London and the river carried muddy water, Elizabeth's chambers were finally transformed into a gloomy, closed chamber. The curtains remained tightly drawn, not so much for the sick woman's peace of mind as to hide from prying eyes the changes that were taking place in her body. Servants entered only at the sign of the senior court physician, and even they tried not to linger for more than a few minutes. According to the notes of one of the pages, kept in a private collection until the mid 19th century, the skin on the queen's legs was covered with ulcers, around which the tissue had turned black. The bandages had to be changed several times a day. Soaked with a murky liquid and blood, they began to emit a pungent odor as soon as they were removed. Fearing infection of the court, the doctors ordered the rags to be burned right in the courtyard, but the wind carried the smoke through the streets, and the townspeople began to whisper that defiled remains were burning in the palace. Every morning began the same way. The doctor checked the pulse, placed his hand on the chest, examined the ulcers, and then ordered an infusion of dried roots and crushed herbs to be brought. The infusion was bitter and left a sticky taste in her mouth, but the queen swallowed it, barely suppressing the urge to vomit. Sometimes, when the pain was severe, she was given warm wine with opium added. Then her speech became slurred, and she began to confuse names, addressing her servants as if they were long-dead relatives. In those days, rumors of the queen's imminent death spread faster than official denials. Ambassadors of foreign powers wrote to their monarchs that the English crown already lies on a pillow next to a dying woman. In the palace itself, there was a struggle over who would be at her bedside in her final hours. Old advisers tried to hold their positions, while young favorites sought to enter the chambers under the pretext of caring for her. According to one of the chaplains, who was allowed to hear her confession, Elizabeth spoke quietly but insistently that she did not want to die surrounded by traitors. She asked that everyone who had participated in the negotiations for her niece's marriages to foreign princes, be removed from her chambers, accusing them of already dividing my body like land after a war. The priest claimed that she was crying, but there were no tears. Her face had become dry, her skin stretched tight like parchment. With each passing day, she slept less and less. Sometimes, at night, she would call out to someone, pointing to the corner of the room, but there was no one there. Doctors attributed this to feverish visions, signs of a weakened heart and prolonged inflammation. However, the servants spoke of whispers coming from empty corners and a strange feeling of coldness when they passed by her bed. Medical procedures became increasingly cruel. Several times a week, doctors performed bloodletting. A thin knife cut a vein in her arm or leg, and the blood was collected in a bowl. After such procedures, she lay pale with trembling fingers, unable to speak. Once, during a dressing change, so much fluid poured out of one of the sores that the court physician ordered all the bedding to be changed immediately. 3 people lifted her body to remove the sheets, but she screamed so loudly that the guards rushed into the room, thinking she was being attacked. By this time, access to the queen was strictly limited. The guards checked everyone who entered, recording their names in a log. Even ambassadors with special permission were allowed to stay at her bedside for no more than a quarter of an hour, and only in the presence of a doctor. All this gave rise to even more rumors. It was said that the queen no longer recognized people, that her body was rotting, that she kept a dagger under her pillow so that she could not be taken away alive. According to reports from the Privy Council, security around the palace was tightened in March. Several influential lords left London, taking their families and valuables with them. Merchants complained that purchases for the palace had decreased, and that the royal kitchen had stopped ordering meat in the same quantities as before. It all looked as if the authorities were preparing for change, but were hesitant to announce it openly. Elizabeth's condition continued to deteriorate. She began to avoid mirrors, demanding that they be removed from her chambers. Sometimes she would sit motionless for hours, staring into space, and then begin to whisper something into the ear of the nearest servant. No one knew what she was saying, but after such conversations, the maids were hurriedly sent away, and sometimes even dismissed. By the end of the month, her face had darkened, her lips were covered with a crust, and her breathing became labored. The doctor said that her heart was beating like a frightened bird. Elizabeth almost stopped eating and drank only warm wine. When the doctor suggested increasing the dose of opium, she turned away, saying, "I don't want to meet the Lord in my sleep." The palace already understood that time was running out, but until death came, no one dared to take the decisive step. It all resembled a prolonged siege. On the one hand, the queen's body slowly succumbing to illness. On the other, the circles of power, ready to close in the moment when her last breath ceased. The hardest part was yet to come. Her illness had reached the stage when the pain was no longer bearable, and her mind was no longer clear. At the same time, the palace intrigues intensified. The legacy, the throne, the fate of the country. Everything depended on how many more blows her heart could withstand. By mid-April, the Queen's chambers no longer resembled the residence of a monarch, but rather the cramped, stuffy chamber of a dying person, where every breath was difficult. The air was heavy, filled with the smell of heated bodies. old medicinal ointments, and slowly spreading rot. The curtains had not been drawn for weeks, partly because of Elizabeth's weakness, partly because of a desire to hide her appearance from prying eyes. According to physician Robert Cecil's personal notes, by this time, deep ulcers had formed on the queen's legs, the edges of which had turned black. Any touch caused sharp pain, making her shudder and clench her teeth. A liquid with a pungent, sweetish odor oozed from the wounds. The rags used to bandage them had to be burned in copper bowls in the fireplace to prevent the smell from spreading throughout the palace. Even these measures did not help. The guards at the doors complained that the stench is coming through the wood. Bloodletting, which was still being practiced according to old medical practices, only caused her to faint and become even weaker. After each procedure, she lay motionless, her eyes closed, her pulse barely discernible on her wrist. The doctors argued among themselves about what was worse, to leave her without treatment or to continue, risking hastening the end. Elizabeth's mental state changed noticeably during those weeks. She increasingly fell into delirium, talking to deceased relatives and calling out the names of advisers who had long since left the court. One night, when a violent storm struck London, she got out of bed without assistance, leaning on the edge of the table and staring into the darkness, said, "They are waiting for me behind the wall." A maid who witnessed this was sent to the countryside the next morning for health reasons. Tension around the Queen's chambers reached a breaking point. The lords and courtiers were divided into camps. Some insisted on an immediate council to discuss the succession, while others demanded that the illness be kept secret until the very end. Ambassadors from foreign countries knocked on the doors demanding an audience, but they were met by guards with a curt message: Her Majesty is resting. Inside, according to the recollections of one of the pages, screams were heard more and more often during dressing changes. When the ulcers were opened, the pain caused Elizabeth to grab her servant's hands so tightly that bruises remained on their wrists. Sometimes she even pushed away her confessor when he tried to read prayers. She said, "First, remove those who are waiting for my death outside the door." Her body was changing alarmingly quickly. Her face turned yellow. The skin on her hands became thin, and blue spots appeared on her fingers. Her breathing was hoarse, with long pauses. At times, she stopped responding to words, and after a few minutes, suddenly began asking questions about the position of the fleet or the state of the treasury, as if emerging from the depths of her illness for a few brief moments. At night, 2 or 3 guards and one doctor were on duty in her chambers. In the silence, only her heavy breathing could be heard, and sometimes the sound of footsteps in the corridor when the advisers left the closed doors. Several times, skirmishes broke out between the servants and the guards. Those who wanted to go inside were refused and shouted that the Queen is being held captive. By this time, the riot in the corridors was no less dangerous than the disease itself. One of the secret reports sent to the council stated that if death comes suddenly, the doors will be broken down and the body taken to a foreign residence before the will is read. This was the reason why an armed guard was constantly at Elizabeth's bedside, not to protect her life, but to protect the power she still symbolized. Spring was coming, but nothing changed in her chambers except the speed of her decline. The pain became constant, and the ulcers ate deeper and deeper into her flesh. Even the doctors, accustomed to difficult cases, began to avoid lengthy examinations. One of them, in a private conversation with a confidant, said, "We are not treating her. We are just making sure she doesn't die before they are ready." This was no longer just the fading of a monarch. It was a protracted, agonizing wait for the end, in which every minute brought the country closer to a turning point, and the palace itself closer to an explosion of intrigue. In early May, her breathing became barely audible, and her face took on a gray hue, as if the blood had drained from her skin. Her fingers and toes were cold even under several layers of woolen blankets. The doctors gathered at her bedside no longer argued. They knew the outcome was inevitable. Their task was reduced to recording every hour and preparing a report for the council. The room was silent, broken only by the occasional cough and the creaking of a chair when one of the doctors changed the bandages. The smell was so thick that even the guards at the door held vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs over their faces. The bandages on Elizabeth's legs no longer hid the blackness of the tissue. The skin beneath was peeling off in pieces, and with every movement new cracks appeared. Sometimes a thick, dark liquid oozed from the wounds, which the doctors carefully removed with rags and immediately threw into the fire. Rumors about her condition could no longer be concealed. On the streets of London, people said that the Queen had died and that a double was being kept in the palace to buy time. People gathered at the palace gates, demanding news. Ambassadors from foreign powers demanded an immediate audience but were refused. Some saw this as a harbinger of a change of dynasty, others as the danger of a coup. The day before her death, she finally refused to eat. She drank only warm wine with a drop of opium to dull the pain a little. Her eyes were cloudy, but in rare moments of clarity she uttered short phrases. "Don't give it to them. Let him be buried with me." None of those present dared to write down what exactly she was saying. The night before her death was restless. Security was tightened in the corridor, and only one priest and two doctors were left in the room. Shortly after midnight, she began to shiver violently. Her body trembled slightly, and her breathing became rapid and shallow. At one point, she opened her eyes and, as the report said, looked at the ceiling as if someone was standing there. After that, her breathing slowed, and her heart, according to the doctor, stopped like a candle extinguished by a draft. Her body was covered with a thin sheet and left for an hour to make sure there were no signs of life. When the guards and servants entered the room, the smell became almost unbearable. They carried her out in their arms, wrapped in a thick cloth to hide her from the eyes of the courtiers and avoid rumors about the condition of her body. The corridors were silent. Only the creaking of the floorboards accompanied the process. The difficulties began immediately. They began to prepare the body for embalming. But according to the master, the tissues were falling apart in our hands, and the smell was eating into the clothes. The work was interrupted several times in an attempt to find stronger mixtures, but nothing helped. In the end, it was decided to close the coffin lid ahead of time. The news of Elizabeth's death spread instantly. Bells rang in London, but along with the mourning, there was a sense of tense anticipation in the city. The council convened that same day to decide the question of succession. A fierce struggle began between supporters of the old nobility and the new favorites. Ambassadors of foreign powers summoned couriers, sending requests for audiences with the new rulers. who had not yet been officially named. The people in the streets reacted in different ways. Some wept, remembering the long years of her reign, while others said that the time for change has come. The markets were operating at half capacity, shops were closing early. Everyone was waiting for the announcement of the new monarch. Elizabeth's death marked not only the end of her reign, but also the beginning of political chaos. Her departure paved the way for a restructuring of the entire court, a redistribution of land and positions, and a change in foreign policy. But those who witnessed her final days remembered not her achievements or glory, but a dark, stuffy room, muffled whispers behind the door, and the slow, painful passing of a woman whose name, only yesterday, people were afraid to utter aloud without her title.